They say you've changed. You're not as patient, not as soft, not as understanding. But here's the truth. You didn't lose patience. You stopped tolerating what was draining you. And that shift, it threatens people who benefited from your silence. You didn't become difficult. You became unavailable for disrespect. And that changes everything. If you've been feeling misunderstood lately, if people say you're too much since you started saying no, this is an attitude. This is evolution. And today, we're going to talk about what really happens when a woman gains standards. There was a version of you who tolerated more than she should have. You called it patience. You called it loyalty. You called it being understanding. But if you're honest, it was fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being too demanding. So you stayed calm when you were hurt. You stayed quiet when you were disappointed. You gave grace when you needed accountability. And everyone praised you for it. You're so mature. You're so easy to talk to. You're not like other women. What they really meant was, you don't make me uncomfortable. Because real standards make people uncomfortable, especially people who were coasting. You see, patience is a virtue, but overtolerance is self-betrayal. There's a difference between being emotionally regulated and emotionally suppressed. One is strength, the other is survival. And many women are taught to survive in relationships, not thrive in them. You were taught that love requires endurance. That commitment means staying, even when it slowly erodes you. That being a good woman means absorbing more than you express. So you absorbed and absorbed and absorbed until something inside you got tired. Not dramatic, not explosive, just tired. Tired of explaining basic respect. Tired of pretending inconsistency was just how he is. Tired of being the emotionally intelligent one in a room full of avoidance. And here's the psychological shift no one talks about. When a woman heals her nervous system, her tolerance changes. The anxious version of you, called unpredictability chemistry. The healed version calls it instability. The younger you felt special for being chosen. The evolved you asks, does this man even qualify? That's not ego. That's self-worth. And self-worth always looks like attitude to someone who preferred you insecure. This is why people say you've changed. Because you have. You no longer chase clarity, beg for consistency, over-explain your boundaries, reward minimal effort, confuse intensity with intimacy. You don't react faster. You leave faster. And that's what scares them. Because patience kept you available. Standards make you selective. And selective women cannot be controlled. With confusion, let's go deeper. When you were overly patient, you were trying to earn love. You believed, if I'm calm enough, he'll stop being distant. If I'm supportive enough, he'll choose me fully. If I don't complain, he won't leave. That's not patience. That's conditional self-worth. It's the psychology of, I'll shrink so I don't get abandoned. But standards shift the internal dialogue. Now it sounds like, if you can't show up consistently, I'm not staying. If I have to convince you to value me, I'm already out. If your effort drops, so does my access. Notice something. There's no anger in that. Just clarity. And clarity feels cold to people who benefited from your confusion. Here's another truth. When a woman gains standards, she becomes less impressed. Charm doesn't move her. Potential doesn't seduce her. Words don't hypnotize her. She watches patterns. She observes effort. She measures consistency, not because she's hardened, but because she's aware. And awareness is power. This is where many relationships end. not because she became too much, but because she stopped accepting too little. And the people who accuse you of losing patience, they are often the ones who lost unlimited access. You don't argue as much anymore. You don't explain as much anymore. You don't chase resolution. You assess. And if it doesn't align, you detach. That's not emotional withdrawal. That's emotional maturity. Because mature love doesn't require constant fixing. It requires reciprocity. And reciprocity is where standards live. Here's the quiet revolution happening inside you. You no longer believe that being chosen is the prize. Being respected is. Being consistent is. Being safe is. And when you taste emotional safety, chaos becomes unattractive. Drama becomes exhausting. Mixed signals become disqualifying. This is growth, not bitterness. You didn't lose patience. You lost the need to tolerate behavior that contradicted your value. And that is the moment a woman becomes powerful because once she stops negotiating with disrespect, she becomes impossible to manipulate. And that is where your standards begin to shape your future. Here's the part no one prepares you for. When you raise your standards, it gets quiet, not peaceful at first. Quiet, fewer messages, fewer invitations, fewer almost relationships. Because when you stop accepting crumbs, people who only had crumbs to offer stop knocking. And for a moment, that silence feels like loss. You start wondering, was I too rigid? Too cold? Too unrealistic? But look deeper. You're not experiencing rejection. You're experiencing filtration. Standards filter out what survival once entertained. The old you felt validated by attention. The evolving you feels validated by alignment. That shift, it narrows the room. And narrowing the room can feel lonely when you were used to being surrounded by almost commitment, almost consistency, almost love. You used to live in the gray area. Now you require clarity. And clarity scares people who survive on ambiguity. Here's the psychological truth. When your nervous system heals, your attraction changes. You no longer feel chemistry with chaos. You no longer feel drawn to emotional unavailability. You no longer interpret anxiety as passion. And because of that, familiar patterns disappear. That can feel like something is missing. But what's missing is dysfunction. You're not bored. You're regulated. And regulated feels unfamiliar. When you were conditioned to equate love with emotional roller coasters, this is why some women go back. Because peace feels empty when your body is addicted to unpredictability. But you didn't come this far to romanticize instability. You raised your standards because you were tired of surviving relationships. And survival always comes with adrenaline. Standards come with stillness. Stillness can feel like loneliness before it feels like power. Let's talk about the identity shift happening here. When you tolerated more, you were needed. You were the fixer, the therapist, the understanding one, the emotionally mature one. You were valuable because you absorbed dysfunction. Now, you don't absorb, you observe. And that changes how people experience you. You're no longer overavailable, no longer over-accommodating, no longer over-invested. You match energy, you mirror effort, you withdraw from inconsistency. That disrupts dynamics. Where you were the emotional safety net, some people won't adjust. They'll exit. Let them. Because standards are not about controlling others. They're about controlling access. And access is a privilege, not a right. Here's another uncomfortable truth. When you gain standards, you also lose fantasy. You stop falling in love with potential. You stop imagining who someone could become. You start accepting who they are now. That alone eliminates half of modern dating, but it protects your future. You no longer date projects. You date patterns, and patterns don't lie. This level of discernment feels isolating because it's rare. Most people still operate from wounds. You are learning to operate from wholeness, and wholeness doesn't beg, it chooses. You may notice something else. You don't feel urgency anymore. You're not rushing timelines, not forcing labels, not chasing reassurance. You're observing consistency over time. That patience, that real patience, is different from overtolerance. It's not rooted in fear. It's rooted in standards. You're willing to wait for what aligns, and that willingness to wait is what makes you powerful. Because desperation accepts anything. Standards accept selectively. Yes, it may feel lonelier right now, but that loneliness is space. Space for better connections, stronger boundaries, healthier dynamics. Space for someone who doesn't feel intimidated by your clarity. The truth, raising your standards, doesn't reduce your options. It removes your distractions. And distractions used to keep you busy enough to ignore your own dissatisfaction. Now you can feel everything: the boredom, the quiet, the empty evenings, but also the peace, the self-trust, the absence of anxiety, the calm nervous system. You're no longer checking your phone obsessively, no longer decoding mixed signals, no longer wondering where you stand. Because if you have to wonder, you're gone. That's not harsh. That's healed. This stage is where many women almost compromise again because the silence tempts you to lower the bar just a little. Don't. Temporary loneliness is cheaper than permanent self-betrayal, and the woman you are becoming cannot coexist with the standards you used to tolerate. You didn't lose patience. You gained discernment. You gained self-respect. You gained the ability to walk away before resentment builds. And that, even if it feels isolating, is the foundation of the love you actually deserve. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. When you gain standards, you become a mirror, and not everyone wants to see themselves clearly. The moment you stop overfunctioning, people have to confront they're underfunctioning. The moment you stop over-explaining, they have to confront their lack of effort. The moment you stop chasing, their passivity becomes obvious. And that exposure, it feels like rejection to them. So they say, "You've changed. You're too guarded. You expect too much. You're not as sweet as you used to be." What they mean is, you're not as convenient. Standards remove convenience. You're no longer easy to keep. You're intentional to earn. And emotionally immature people struggle with that shift because your growth forces a decision: rise or retreat. Many retreat, not because you're wrong, but because growth requires self-reflection, and self-reflection threatens ego. Let's talk psychology. When someone benefited from your overtolerance, your new boundaries feel like loss of control. They were comfortable when you always initiated repair. You excused inconsistency. You accepted apologies without change. You minimized your own hurt. You prioritized connection over self-respect. Now, you pause. You observe. You withdraw access. You don't argue to be understood. You leave to be respected. That shift destabilizes dynamics that relied on your emotional labor. And when people lose unearned access, they often react with criticism. Criticism is easier than accountability. This is where many women doubt themselves, because when multiple people say, "You're different," it feels like you're the problem. But evolution always looks extreme to those committed to staying the same. You're not extreme. You're aligned. You no longer romanticize potential. You assess patterns. You no longer accept, I'm trying. You observe results. You no longer reward intensity. You require consistency. And consistency is rare among the emotionally unready. There's something deeper happening here. Your standards activate insecurity. In people who relied on your insecurity, read that again. When you were unsure of yourself, they felt powerful. When you questioned your worth, they felt chosen. When you tolerated confusion, they felt safe. But now, you're steady. You're observant. You're willing to walk. That stability exposes instability. And unstable people will call stable women cold. They'll say, "You don't fight for us anymore." No, you don't fight for confusion anymore. You don't negotiate your value anymore. You don't audition for roles you already qualify for. Here's the shadow side of growth. You will outgrow people who were attached to your wounds. Some connections only worked because you were anxious. Some dynamics only functioned because you overgave. Some relationships survived because you underasked. When those traits disappear, so does the compatibility. That's not failure. That's truth surfacing. This is why raising standards often shrinks your circle, not because you became superior, but because you became unavailable for misalignment. And misalignment always feels like tension to those who prefer comfort over growth. You may notice something else. You're less reactive now, not because you don't care, but because you evaluate before engaging. You ask yourself, is this worth my energy? Is this aligned with my future? Is this behavior consistent? That pause, that space, is maturity. And maturity is intimidating to people who depend on impulsivity. When you no longer react emotionally, manipulation loses power. When you no longer fear walking away, control dissolves. When you no longer seek validation, attention loses leverage. That's why some people escalate. They test. They provoke. They withdraw to trigger pursuit. But the new you? You don't chase withdrawal. You interpret it. An interpretation protects you. You're no longer asking, how do I make this work? You're asking, does this even deserve my effort? That question alone filters out half of what used to drain you. Here's the truth many won't admit. High standards force low effort to self-eliminate, and low effort resents that. Because when you stop settling, you stop validating mediocrity, and mediocrity hates comparison to excellence. You are not asking for perfection. You are asking for consistency, respect, effort, emotional availability, basic foundations. But to someone unwilling to give them, that feels excessive. Your standards are not the problem. Their capacity is. And once you see capacity clearly, you stop negotiating with it. You either accept it or you leave it. That's power. You didn't lose patience. You lost the illusion. That potential equals partnership. You lost the habit of shrinking for comfort. You lost the tolerance for emotional immaturity. And yes, some people will fall away because of that. But the ones who remain, they won't be intimidated by your standards. They'll meet them. Here's the part most people don't see coming. When the right person meets your standards, they don't feel attacked. They feel relieved. Relieved that you're clear. Relieved that you know what you want. Relieved that you don't play games. Because emotionally healthy people don't fear standards. They appreciate them. Your boundaries don't intimidate someone mature. They inform them. They show them how to love you well. And for the first time, you won't feel like you're asking for too much. You'll feel matched. Matched in effort. Matched in clarity. Matched in consistency. There won't be confusion to decode. No mixed signals to analyze. No emotional breadcrumbs to survive on. Just steady behavior. And steady might feel unfamiliar at first because you're used to intensity. But intensity is not intimacy. Chaos is not chemistry. And unpredictability is not passion. Real connection feels calm. It feels like you don't have to perform. You don't have to prove. You don't have to overgive. You simply show up, and they meet you there. That's what standards create. They don't push love away. They filter out what isn't love. You stopped entertaining potential. So now you attract readiness. You stopped chasing validation. So now you recognize reciprocity. You stopped over-tolerating. So now you experience respect. And here's the most powerful shift of all. You no longer measure love by how much you can endure. You measure it by how safe you feel. Safe to speak. Safe to express. Safe to say no. Safe to walk away. And know you'll be fine. That's not coldness. That's self-trust. The woman who gains standards also gains peace. She sleeps better. She second-guesses less. She doesn't obsess over texts. She doesn't chase clarity, because clarity is built into the connection. And if it's not, she exits without drama. That quiet exit, that's the loudest proof of growth. You didn't lose patience. You lost your tolerance. For inconsistency, you lost your attachment. To being chosen at any cost, you lost your willingness to abandon yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. And that loss, it's actually a gain in self-respect, discernment, emotional maturity, power, the kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. It simply walks away when standards aren't met and stays when they are. If you're in this season right now, where it feels quieter, where your circle is smaller, where dating feels more selective, don't panic. You are not losing options. You are refining alignment. Temporary loneliness is the bridge between old patterns and new standards. Cross it, because the woman who waits for alignment never regrets it, and the woman who refuses to shrink never has to rebuild her dignity later. You didn't lose patience. You finally realized that love should meet you, not cost you yourself. If this resonated with you, if you felt the shift, if people have told you you've changed, comment, I gained standards. Let other women see that they're not alone in this evolution. And if you're building a life where your peace is protected and your worth is non-negotiable, subscribe, because here, we don't teach women how to be chosen. We remind them they are the standard.